Welcome to Orthodox Christian Theology. This is Craig Trulia, and with me today is Father Peter Heers. Father, great to have you on again.
Good to be back with you, Patrick, and always a pleasure to speak to your audience, which I know are very diligent in Orthodox Christian theology. That's a great honor. Thank you.
Well, Father, it's last show we did got me in trouble with YouTube, so I hope this show won't do the same. But I think the topic of baptism and its history in the church is something that probably will get the YouTube censors a little less angry than the other topic we covered. So before we jump into anything, I want your react to this, all right? So I'm going to put a picture on the screen. Here it is. What's your reaction to that?
I just immediately say Kyrie eleison. I don't know what else to say at this point. What is happening? Lord have mercy.
I mean, luckily the picture supposedly was fake. It was just some sort of dark humor that they all had. At least that's the story they're telling. So just so people are aware, this supposedly was not a COVID era baptism, but if it was, it does bring up the obvious question of form in baptism, which will come up during this interview. So that's why I wanted to start with that picture, just because there are situations where crazy things happen, and then pastoral judgment calls have to be made. And
well, I would say that it might have been a joke or something, but there's one thing that is consistent with contemporary Latin practice, and it's the amount of water that's used is probably not much different than what the amount of water that would have come out of that squirt gun.
That is true.
It's very, very little over the forehead. And so in that sense, it seems to be representative of contemporary practice. The degree of immersion is far from the vast majority of Latin attempts at baptism today.
And it begs the question, then what would make the water gun baptism invalid? I'll just put it back on the screen so people could see what we're talking about. Like, then what makes it invalid? Simply because it's impious? But then wouldn't that be like a Donatist heresy? That, well, just the impiety of the people performing it invalidates it? So then you have to look at this, go, no, it's valid. It's just in very bad taste. Good question. I'd just say the only person that's nothing to worry about in that picture is the baby. If it were real. The baby is an innocent party in what's going on there. So that being said, Father, how is the book selling? You know, how is this debut? What are you hearing? I hear it's going gangbusters.
Well, thanks be to God. We had in the first 10 days, we sold over 1,300 copies, which is, I think, unbelievable for most books. Orthodox books, in my experience as a publisher. I've been doing this since 2000, so 23 years into this. We sold that much probably with Ecclesiology 15 years ago. Maybe we reached those numbers, but this is a specialized book. It's a particular kind of book. It's a big, hefty 700 footnotes. It's not your typical, popular release where kids book or something like a popular Life of the Saints. So the fact that we sold 1,300 in the first 10 days, I think is tremendous. It's a sign that a lot of people are interested in this topic. A lot of people want to know what the fathers have to say, and it's extremely important to the life of the church. So I think that confirms it for us.
The question is whether or not the book is selling more copies and the quote minds are getting clicks. So that's
you have to overcome that. Yeah, good question. We've been doubling down. I tell all of our team, when people say X, Y, Z about some secondary, tertiary, distraction ad hominem, I say don't respond as much as we can resist, and just say read the book, because that's really where we need to do. We need to have a serious discussion, serious people on the basis of the fathers. You can disagree with our take or our conclusions, of course, but you can't disagree with the church fathers and what they have to say. And we need to face them head on and read them. And this book has, hundreds and hundreds of references to the church fathers and covering the whole 2,000-year period of the church. So I don't think anybody who's serious about the topic can ignore the book and still say I'm well read on the topic. And that's what I hope people take seriously and read the book. I mean, come to your own conclusions, but read the book.
I'm hoping to, in this interview, tease out things that if you own the book, give you more layers and more perspectives. What this interview is not going to be about is everything the book's about. You could get the book for that, and I recommend that people do get the book in order to get the perspective, the details you're giving. And so, how about we just get going? And let me ask you this broadly: the principles of Acrivia and economia, if I'm pronouncing them correctly. What are the principles of these, and how do they apply to the sacrament of baptism?
So the economia Acrivia might call it an interpretive key, or the way that we understand the pastoral practice and the management of the household. The term economia, let's start there. It literally means ecos for house or household, and nomos, which is the law. So another way to say it is the management or the law, the norm, the working out of the norm of the church, and the application of the gospel in each place, in each time. So Acrivia is probably translated best as exactitude. So you have the exact, let's say, canon on this particular topic, and we follow, as St. Basil says in his canons, for instance, to keep the Acrivia, keep the exactitude of the canons. He calls for us to follow with exactitude the canons laid down by the fathers. He allows for economia, the management in particular times and places, which is, according to the discretion of the church overseers, the bishops and priests, according to the patristic mind always, and according to the received tradition and practice. But in particular circumstances, you have to apply it, and this can never be taken away from the episcopacy, and then by extension the priesthood. They always will and must have the ability to economizun, to economize, or to manage and apply in particular circumstances. So that is this twofold method of management or governing of the church is time immemorial. There's an idea out there which is really mistaken, and it's tragic that we have some great academic theologians who have suggested that this is a late innovation of someone in the 18th century, namely the Colivardis, Fathers of St. Nicodemus, with regard to the question of reception, right? They accept, obviously, that we have this in the general management of the household of faith, but with regard to the question of reception, this is idea that, it's very late, that the church was never doing this before, which is really tragic, because it's very clearly witnessed to again and again, and especially in the canons of St. Basil the Great. It's very obvious that this is not an innovation of somebody in the 18th century, but right there in the canons of St. Basil. So the church says, the Acrivia is going to be the gospel. I mean, we're going to follow the commandments and put into practice the commandments of the gospel and the teachings of our Lord. That has to be the starting point, and that has to be the standard. And the ecumenical councils are coming to confirm that, and to defend that, and to put boundaries around that experience and that teaching. And then the church in particular times and places, depending on a variety of circumstances and a variety of challenges, perhaps, will depart from that Acrivia, but it's only for a time. So you might think of it as a slight detour on the road, but they're going to bring you back to the main artery, right? You're not going to be going off into the fields. That's not economy. And I think today what we increasingly have is the term economy being used, even becoming the rule, and it actually is an overturning of the Acrivia, an overturning of the exactitude. And so it's not properly, it should not be properly referred to as economia, but paranomia in Greek, which is basically illegal, or something that's illegal, something that's not according to the law. The church, of course, does not have a law and understand the law in the same way the world does. The law, in this case, is a guideline and a directive, let's say, for the shepherds in every place, time, to apply. But you cannot ignore that. You can't say I'm a shepherd and I ignore that. You can't say I'm a shepherd and I don't follow the presuppositions laid down, the criteria, the consensus of the fathers. That would not be economia either. I mean, so there's this idea that the bishop basically is free to do whatever he likes in the question of reception, and that simply is not the case. There's a whole library of patristic material that would say that that's not the case. Right? We definitely, as shepherds, have to follow the Holy Fathers and be guided by their examples, their teachings, the precedents laid down. And so let me just answer this, a critique that we've heard. Somebody said, for instance, and I think this is something that's been repeated. Well, what's the point of this book? Why do we need this book if the bishops are going to do it anyway? Why do the laymen even need to read about this? Why do non clergy need to know what the church believes, or it's going to be applied in any case by the bishops? Well, there's two problems with that approach, which I've never heard in my 20 years in Greece. And that is, first of all, what we're addressing in the book is not simply the application, or really at all the application in particular times and places today of economy. I mean, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the principles laid down, the presuppositions laid down, the criteria laid down, which guide the church, therefore, to understand the boundaries, understand that which is outside, and how it can be received or economized. Those things are universal and they're applicable to everyone because they touch on the ecclesiology of the church. They touch on the dogma of the church. So this book is really about Christ, the body, the boundaries, the nature, the identity of the church. Ultimately, this whole book is talking about that. It's not talking about particular, like, what do we do today in, Kansas City with so-and-so? Obviously, that's not what the book can address, but it can address how those pastors, what would they look to? What would be their guiding principles? The fathers, what would they do in terms of precedent, in the history of the church? So there's, again, two aspects to the book, two aspects of this question. One is the ecclesiological question, which is definitely touched on all the time. Like in this discussion, we're touching on ecclesiology constantly. And there's the question of the actual application of economy and the principles by which one applies economy. And so sometimes we have departure from that, or rejection of that economy is even a question. That's even like on the table. We don't even have economy in this instance of reception of heterodox, or we have a distortion of what economy means. That's addressed in the book. The other time we have the whole question of ecclesiology, and that I was shocked in a discussion I had 2 weeks ago at the Antiochian Convention with somebody who's considered a kind of representative, I guess, in what do you want to call it, mainstream American Orthodoxy or whatever, but he was expressing his views on this question. And I'll end with this, and we can go on to the next question if you like, or expand on it. But I said to him, Father, help me understand something. And this, I think this goes back to the question, and it answers it in a way. So somebody comes to you and says, I want to be baptized. I mean, he's a Protestant, he's a Roman Catholic, whatever. I say, I want to be baptized. Please baptize me. And you say, no, I will not baptize you. I cannot baptize you. You must be chrismated. How is that possible? Because my understanding of economy is that there's a need, right? There's a necessity. We're responding to some exception, some necessity to go and use and apply economy. But there's no necessity when somebody's begging you to be baptized. So how do you explain that practice? And he said to me, well, we explain it because there's grace in the mysteries of the heterodox. And I didn't expect that answer, because that's another ecclesiology, right? That's not a question of economy, Acrivia. That's a question of what is the church? What are the boundaries of the church? What is the mystery? Where are the mysteries? So he immediately cut to the chase and said, I have another ecclesiology. And that's how I answered that question. And then he said, economy is the rule because there's grace in the mysteries of the heterodox. And then he was just 1 second, I'll stop. And he said, he gave me an example, which I guess is an example that they're entertaining in the Assembly of Bishops, the committee that's been appointed a couple years ago. And that is that he claims, I've never seen this, that up until 1800, or at least for a couple hundred years, up until 1800, they were receiving Latins by simply anointing on the forehead, and it was not considered chrismation. It was just considered an oil of reconciliation or something along these lines. And then in 1800s, they started to chrismate, I guess, post Cyril V or something. Now, this is all news to me, but even if it was the case, does that really follow in either? I mean, this whole line of thinking follow the ecumenical councils? Does it follow the canons of St. Basil? But the idea then he's saying is, since we were doing that for a time, therefore we recognize implicitly that there were grace in the mysteries, since we were only reconciling them with oil. So again, they're doubling down. Some people are doubling down and saying this is a question of ecclesiology. And so to answer the people who say, why do we need this book? Well, because the people who are pushing chrismation as a rule are doing it on the basis of a new ecclesiology. I think it's a new ecclesiology.
Now, what's with the temptation to turn the exception to the rule? If I could ask you that, just very broadly, why do it, like, just because it could be done or it has been done, why does that become the rule? I don't see the compelling reason for it. Is there a compelling reason?
Again, I don't think there is, unless you posit another ecclesiology, unless you say there is grace and we cannot baptize, and that's where a small portion. I don't know how big this group is in at least Western Orthodoxy, but that's the only way you can make sense of that. Because clearly, I mean, look at St. Basil's Canon 47. I think Canon 47 is hugely important. If you want to understand the mind of the Church, mind of the Fathers, this is a canon accepted by the ecumenical councils. St. Basil's canons are considered cornerstone.
Well, Father, right before we get to the canons, let me ask a question, because I've never been dying in the hospital and I'm not a priest. So, like, if I'm in the hospital and dying and I've confessed and everything, and you commune me as a priest, I presume that you're not going to make an issue whether I fasted before communing, because it's a near-death situation, right?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And so, because that is possible, does that render completely unnecessary the fact that we, as a matter of practice, always fast before communing?
Absolutely not.
Right. So that's what I'm not understanding here, which is when people discuss this issue, the question is not whether such and such thing has been done before and whether it could be done, but the real question is, all right, should it be done? And does this meet the standard that St. Vincent de Lérens says, that it's always been done since antiquity, that's been done everywhere since antiquity, that there's a true consensus around it? And I think people kind of see, well, something happened in Russia at some time, or something happened in the West, or literally in one patriarchate, in Rome's patriarchate for a certain period of time, that then this Samoan does everything, which to me, if we apply that principle to like the communion example I just gave, it just seems to be the antithesis to how we approach everything in Orthodoxy. I don't know what your comments on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're seeing an overturning of the ascetic life in that particular case. But there is the person dying on the deathbed is definitely engaged in an ascetic struggle. So the Church is not going to ask something more when they're already going through an amazing ascetic, physical, spiritual struggle. And so the Church is not doing away with, even in that case, that exception, is not doing away with the presuppositions at all. It's saying they're already fulfilled. And the Church is not against the body, and fasting is not something that kills the body, but it actually purifies and makes it stronger. And so in no way can the Church ever ultimately overturn its own principles, its own therapeutic method, with any exception. And so, for instance, the reading of the Didache, this is a great example. People always bring this up. Well, the Didache says this, Didache says that, but people read the Didache all wrong in a legalistic manner. The Didache clearly states baptism, the exactitude, the Acrivia, is triple immersion. That's where they start. And then it says, if this, and then it gets to the point where it says, well, if you don't have living water, you don't have running water, can't do this, then you can do this. And so clearly right there, we have the Acrivia economia distinction. And in no way is the Didache saying, hey, it doesn't matter what you do. There's no rhyme or reason. You can do either one. This is where they end up, and the Latins end up following Aquinas. They rationalize it, and they, in a very legalistic way, they say all three are fine. But there's a clear hierarchy, even in the Didache, that no, all three are not fine. There's a presupposition for the departure from the norm, and that is you can't get living water, right? You can't. You're on a deathbed and you can't fast, right? There's a necessity that demands the economy, and so what's the necessity when people are begging you for baptism? There is none, and there's no justification for economy in that case.
Okay, now, Father, because we're touching the canons, and I rudely interrupted you, let's talk a little about the origin of the apostolic canons, or does that even matter, right? So, and what do they teach on this question of baptism?
The apostolic canons you're talking about.
Yeah.
The apostolic canons are hugely important because, as you know, in contemporary academia in the West, they reject them as not being truly apostolic or not being truly of the apostles, which is really not important, frankly, because the minute the church accepts the canons and the fathers accept the canons in the ecumenical councils, in the Sixth Ecumenical and in Canon 1 of the Seventh, and then you have the Justinian novels 6 and 137, and they're confirmed by Zonaras and Balsamon and Aristerios and Simeon the Magister and Logothetti and Blastaris, and goes on and on and on, and St. John Damascene. And so the church has embraced them again and again and again, and of course, most importantly, in ecumenical council. So the question of their exact origin, or were they written down in the 3rd or the 4th century, is really secondary. It's not important. The church embraces them all the way up until our day. We have saints like St. Luke of Crimea embracing the canon as normative, and maybe not the term normative, but as applicable, as given for the health and the salvation of the people of God. So yeah, I don't think the origins are really, and it's kind of sad because they're trying to undermine the authority of the canons, because I think they're coming at it with a different ecclesiology. And that's why would you try to undermine the authority of the apostolic canons? It's a bit strange.
That is something I want to second you on, which is whenever it's something we see where the liberals have dealt with the scriptures since this late 1800s. It's like, well, if I'm just going to say St. Paul really didn't write Hebrews because he's not named as the author of Hebrews, then somehow it lacks authority, right? So the point is always made as a way of undercutting the authority of the document. Now, to me, however the Epistle of Hebrews is written, it's irrelevant because it's biblical canon. In the same way, the apostolic canons are canonically received by the Sixth Ecumenical Council. And before those who say, well, technically the Council Trullo really wasn't part of the Sixth Ecumenical Council, it happened 10 years later, despite our hagiographic tradition on that question, the Seventh Ecumenical Council, on its first canon, accepts the canons of that council. So, however we dice it, the apostolic canons become canon. Exactly how it became canonical and how precisely it was written, it's sort of irrelevant. What's relevant is it's been universally received as an authority, and these canons actually get quoted during the ecumenical councils as authorities. So, to me, it just seems to be a misnomer. And that's why I wanted to ask a question, because I want people not to get caught up in it. Yeah. It's not relevant. Now, my impression of the apostolic canons is they appear to be the most conservative on the question of baptism. Very Cyprian, though they existed considerably before St. Cyprian, on the question of baptism. Now, do you mind giving some details on exactly what they teach?
Well, there's a number of them that are very applicable. One that I think is extremely important today, because we have this relativization of the form as if it's not important. But the canons, apostolic canons, lay down very clearly that if it's not triple immersion, in fact, they call for the deposition of the priest. In that case, they call for the deposition of the frocking or suspension of the priest in cases such as accepting heretical baptism as Orthodox baptism. And there's 46, 47, the numbers, I think 58. They're all very applicable to our situation today. And I find it very ironic that when people doubt these or reject these as somehow not applicable or not authoritative, they're really doubting the authority of the church, and they're doubting they're being disobedient in a way to the church. And it's usually the same crowd that calls contemporary Orthodox who are insisting on following the canons and calling into question the contemporary practice, which is not following the canons, as disobedient. And so, what is the authority? Like that's a question here that is secondary, I think, ultimately, but it's also very important. Is what is the authority? If we stand and reject the apostolic canons, what are we rejecting? We're rejecting the church's authority ultimately.
And these canons require correct form. They're dismissive over the baptism of heretics and schismatics. And this kind of brings us to how this issue became a real point of contention in the 3rd century, popularly between Saints Cyprian and Saint Stephen of Rome, over whether we need correct baptism in the church, which is Saint Cyprian's view, or Saint Stephen of Rome's view that those outside the church have baptism and they can be received simply by chrismation. And so, do you mind giving the audience some details on the debate that occurred and precisely how it was resolved?
Well, you're probably better equipped to do that as a historian, but I'll do my best. You can fill in the blanks. We have it all in the book, of course. And let me just say this, but it's an opportunity to say this. Some people say that we don't have 3 authors, we just have one. It's Father Peter. That's not the case at all. There were 3 authors, and one is more historical and more learned in history, and others in theology. But in any case, the basics here on Saint Cyprian and Saint Stephen, it's very important, first of all, to state, because again, in rejecting St. Cyprian, as some insist on doing today, they're rejecting the ecumenical councils. They're rejecting the authority of ecumenical councils, because the ecumenical council, Trullo and the Seventh, ratify St. Cyprian's teachings from the council under him in Carthage, and they pay no attention whatsoever to Pope St. Stephen's teachings. They're not mentioned at all in the ecumenical councils. That's not a small matter. It's not a small matter at all. So, of course, Pope Stephen's position of not wanting to receive any heretics by baptism was probably a reaction to the practice of a predecessor there, Pope Callistos of Rome, who baptized the second time those who were already baptized in the church, but had fallen into grievous sins. And so he is probably reacting against his view. The Marcionites also were criticized by St. Epiphanius for this. And so we can kind of, understand where he's coming from. But the problem is he goes to the other extreme. He goes the other extreme, and he starts receiving, not just, of course, not being against, rightly so, against a second baptism of Orthodox, by Orthodox, but against receiving heretical baptisms and not requiring them to be baptized. So, we have on the one hand Pope Stephen, you have St. Augustine later on, who contended that the Marcionites and the Valentinians should not be receiving the church by baptism, nor the Eunomians, according to St. Augustine. But Canon 95 of the 5th, 6th Ecumenical Council decrees that all these heretics should be baptized. As people oftentimes cite 95, but they don't realize that 95 and Canon 7 of the Second Ecumenical say clearly all other heretics must be baptized, giving us the norm, the Acrivia of the church. Of course, has to be baptism is the norm. It's the gospel teaching. So the Ecumenical Council resolved all this by reiterating that baptism is the standard for the reception of the heretics, ratifying as God inspired the apostolic canons and the canons of Carthage under St. Cyprian, while allowing a few specifically named heretical groups to be received by economy due to the circumstances of the times and the fact that these groups retain the Orthodox form of baptism, 3 immersions in the name of the Holy Trinity. That's how the church resolved this question. That's the ecumenical standard. So the debate there's a lot you could talk about. You could talk about the councils before Saint Cyprian that he was following in Africa. You could talk about the councils that happened in Asia Minor that Saint Firmilian are following. These are conciliar decisions. I've never understood why there are Orthodox who seem to follow the papal line and embrace Pope Saint Stephen. He's recognized as a saint, of course, for his martyrdom, his blood shedding, but not for his particular views here. He's not embraced by the church but because of his views on the question of heretical baptism. But I've never understood how Orthodox can get behind that and follow the papal line when we have conciliar decisions and the canons of St. Basil and the ecumenical council's conciliar decisions, which all ignore not only Pope Stephen, but Arles and other views in the West that are totally ignored by the ecumenical councils. It's a bit of a mystery how Orthodox can stand over there and not with the councils, the conciliar tradition.
Yeah, it's I actually cover this topic, and I'm grateful that the book actually covered some stuff I've been saying now for a little while. This topic is going to be covered in even more detail in the Rise and Fall of Papacy, the book that will be published this fall, God willing, by Uncut Mountain Press. Yes. So full disclosure, yes, I have an upcoming book with the publisher Father Peter is involved with. But that being said, though, as a matter of history, the issue of this baptism issue, I think, wrongly gets pit with St. Cyprian and St. Stephen of Rome pitted against each other. This is actually not historically accurate if we go by the primary sources. So people will quote St. Vincent de Lorenz, they'll quote St. Augustine, they'll quote St. Jerome, they'll even quote Eusebius. But people, what they need to look at are the corpus of St. Cyprian's letters, what is remaining of St. Dionysius of Alexandria's letters, and a lot of these are quoted by Eusebius.
Yes.
And why is this important? Because this is what comes out. What comes out is, before St. Stephen of Rome, Cornelius of Rome actually attacked Novatian for the fact that he was baptized via aspersion. And he said this disqualified him from being a priest. So this sort of idea that the Rome of the 3rd century did not have these views of form that are part of the greater Orthodox world is actually not true. St. Stephen of Rome comes out to be somewhat of a innovator on this question. And I'm speaking historically, Orthodox off for the moment. But luckily for St. Stephen of Rome, his entire corpus of letters have disappeared to history, even by the time Eusebius, who was writing about 5 decades later, which is, historically speaking, not a lot. But what happened here? We have a letter from St. Dionysius of Alexandria, where he makes mention of Dionysius of Rome having formerly had the opinions of St. Stephen of Rome, but no longer. And on the question of baptism, well, what precisely was Dionysius' view? Dionysius had a view which is roughly approximated by more canons than what we see strictly the Cyprianic view, which is that if there's proper form, that the baptism does not have to be repeated. But if there's improper form, it does have to be repeated. Now, just so people are aware, there's canons that say that doesn't even matter. If it's amongst
may I correct you? It wouldn't be repeated if the form was not there.
Well, well said.
To be precise, it's important to be precise because we talk about baptism today, and people think that it means pouring and sprinkling, and it does not mean that. So, if we give the impression that one could be baptized without immersion, that's not the canonical or patristic tradition, as the book shows very clearly. So it's an aside. I know you meant that, but I just
and for what it's worth, Dionysius found it's good he said this because Dionysius of Alexandria actually explicitly says that. He says, we don't rebaptize them, we baptize them for the first time, in reference to those with improper form. And just so people are aware, he's quoting St. Cyprian, I believe it's letter 71. And so for all those who think that St. Dionysius of Alexandria was defending Stephen of Rome's view, I don't think this is tenable if you read anything Dionysius of Alexandria wrote. He quotes St. Cyprian more than once.
And St. Dionysius of Alexandria is citing the councils in the East as authoritative.
He is, and he actually says that in opposition to Stephen of Rome. So let's condense this real quick. What became the Roman practice of receiving baptisms with correct form, but not, but even that of, let's say, heretics and schismatics, which became this Western view, which we'll unpack in a second. That view wasn't Stephen of Rome's view. So when people say Stephen of Rome won the day or he had the correct side, that wasn't his view. So that's historically incorrect. That was actually to roughly approximate the view of Dionysius of Alexandria, which Dionysius of Rome then adhered to. And so what happens is Rome reformed their practice, and that became the Roman practice, and the practice in North Africa came to be identified with the Donatists, which is why it then fell out of practice in the West, because there was no Donatists in the East, but there were Donatists in the West. Now, before I get more into that, I want to get back to, if you don't mind me asking a question maybe ahead, and then we'll go back to the ecumenical councils. What are we to make of Western saints after this controversy? So like Augustine and Pope Leo, who spoke of baptism outside the church being an empty form or without the Spirit. Did any saint recognize grace in the form of sacraments outside the church? Because the reason I ask this is that Augustine writes categorically there's no salvation outside the church. There's no Spirit in baptism outside the church. But he'll defend even Marcionite baptisms because he claims they have proper form. So if you don't mind specifying, like, where are these saints really coming from? If they're accepting that there's baptism inside the church in proper form, but they don't see it as salvific.
Well, that's very interesting. I think that that a lot of our viewing of Augustine and the writings of Augustine have been colored by the lens of Aquinas and the Scholastics, and that's partly the why we have varying views on what Augustine taught. He does. You can find, and I found in my reading of Augustine, quotes that seem to contradict. I'm not sure they do. If I looked at the Latin on a few of them, along with a co-worker who knows Latin very well, and there could be different readings. And I think that even the translations into English of some of St. Augustine's expressions on this topic are colored by post-schism, reading of this, where they're like you said, they're following increasingly Pope Stephen and not the others in Rome, and they're not insisting on the form. Post Aquinas, the form is no longer an issue because he interprets baptism to be referring to washing. Well, he looks at different scriptural passages and he says, well, baptism really is just a washing. And well, if it's a washing, it could be done by pouring and sprinkling. So you have a whole different thing that was not present in the third, fourth century. That question, that interpretation of baptism, that approach to the form, I don't think it was there. So you can read in Augustine, just to answer your question, you can read some things that can lead you to believe that he believed that, like this clergyman I talked about earlier, that yes, in the actual mysteries of the heterodox per se, in and of themselves, they have the grace of God. But then there's other quotes from Augustine which seem to say, no, there's no Spirit outside the church. There's no salvation outside the church. And so then you have this development of how to make sense of Augustine. You have a very robust theological development in the West. None of this is at all present in the rest of the church in the East, Greek-speaking East. I don't think they were even familiar with Augustine's writing on these topics for centuries and centuries later. So he played no role in the development of the ecumenical council's decisions, at least not the ones pertaining to this topic. The dogmatic questions are different, but on this particular topic, I don't think he played any role. But I don't. That's what I have to offer. Off the top.
Yeah, I would just say it seems to me a strange point of contention because the reality is these Western saints in the pre-schism church weren't saying like baptism outside the church was really any good. What they were just against was people saying that baptism in proper form couldn't be received, which is not your stance and not the stance of the canons. So let's talk about it. You can
economize. If you have the form, you can economize. You don't have to, though. St. Basil says, yeah, in Rome they're economizing, but I say not to. So right there in 47, which is such an important canon, you have the acknowledgement of the possibility to economize. That's how St. Basil understands the Roman practice in his day. But then he says right there in the same canon, we shouldn't do that. So even though they have the form, even though they call on the Holy Trinity, even though they actually use water and they triple immerse, and even though the particular heretics he's referring to aren't Trinitarian heretics, but they distort God's understand, his the whole question of creation, God's creation, everything, he still insists that they be baptized. I think this is a really important point. Today, people have this idea, if they use the form, they must be received. There's no choice on the part of the pastors of the church. They must be received by chrismation. That's not the case. The church is free always to do Acrivia, to do exactitude.
And so what you're saying is, due to the canons, because there's many, many canons that the ecumenical councils themselves delineate and as well receive, that their economy for proper form is allowable, not for improper form.
Yes.
And if economy for proper form is not seen as beneficial, that they could go stick by their guns and just stick with what the apostolic canons say.
Absolutely. The church
And
is free because the church is Christ working out salvation, and Christ is not subjected to his own commandments, his own law. He's the lawgiver. And so the church is always free, but it has to be according to the mind of Christ and the mind of the fathers and the principles and the criteria of the fathers. It would never go. You couldn't say this is Christ freely economizing, and yet it totally undermines the Acrivia. Like the thief on the cross was received, but it didn't mean in any way he undermined his own commandments for people to be baptized. This always has to be kept in mind when we're talking about economy.
Now, Father, I'm going to ask a really loaded question, but on purpose, which is, what is the bigger confusion among both clergy and the laity in the modern day? That questions over a form, or whether or not baptism outside the church is salvific? Because it would seem to me the decision to follow the economic interpretation of canons versus not would be what's beneficial to salvation of those being received into the church. And so the question is, what is the bigger threat these days, right? Is it that people think that there's salvation outside the church, and salvation, the sacraments outside the church, and there's a Eucharist outside the church, and all these things? Or that, there are these people that they're not being sufficiently clear enough that economy can be given for baptisms with proper form, right? The former seems to be really the area of way more confusion than the latter. I mean, am I off my rocker here?
So I would say there is a small contingent still in my experience. Now I'm not, my experience, I can only speak from my experience, but I've been dealing with this issue for 30 years and talked to a lot of people. So I think I have a pretty informed view of it, at least in, American Orthodoxy and Greek Orthodoxy. I would say there's a small contingent of people who still hold to the idea that we can do economy salvifically and profitably today, and they basically ignore or deny the presupposition of form, and they say this is not necessary. The bishop can do economy even with the form is not there. I think they're wrong, and I think that our book clearly shows that that's not possible. It's not viewed as salvific. It's not viewed as profitable. It undermines ultimately the Acrivia of the church for the Orthodox themselves, and I think there's historical evidence to prove this. And I'll say that, and I don't want to get on a tangent, but it's really interesting. When the whole issue was really being dealt with in the Ecumenical Patriarchate on Mount Athos at the end of the 18th century with St. Nicodemos, St. Paius Velaskovsky, Dorotheus Vulasmas, and others, and they were producing the Pedalion, which is going to be decisive for the Orthodox Church in the 19th century and really translated into many languages. They were already dealing with the effects of Latinized sacramental theology in the Orthodox Church, and they were pushing back against it, particularly St. Paius Velaskovsky, who asked Dorotheus Vulasmas, who was the Patriarchate's appointed reviewer of the Pedalion. He asked him, please write a treatise showing that we must baptize unequivocally all heterodox coming from the West. St. Paius Velaskovsky asked for this. He writes it. He sends it. He has it translated and published in Romanian before his repose. And so they were very cognizant of the fact that among the Orthodox, there was already a deterioration of what it means to be baptized. In other words, the proper form. And so we can see today in places like Bulgaria, Serbia, Russia, and all over the Orthodox world that we have the effects of the Latinized ideas on form, where you see people being baptized in the very Latin way, like just a little bit of water over their forehead, or water poured, sprinkling on their head, and their feet are in. You see these things going on, sprinkling. All of this, I believe, is a confirmation that the fathers wisely said that if the form is not kept, economy is not possible. They doubled down on the form, because when you depart from that and there's a free-for-all for the bishop or priest to just economize as he sees fit without any regard to whether there's even the form, meaning baptism. I mean, baptism is the form. When we say the form, we mean baptism, right? That's what the word means, immersion. So what happens is that the Orthodox themselves, our dogmatic conscience is undermined. We begin to think and operate in ways that are not patristic. We begin to talk about baptism doesn't matter if you're immersed, doesn't matter if you're sprinkled, doesn't matter the form. You hear this all the time today. Where did we get this? We got it from Aquinas. No church father, no church canon. In fact, the opposite is found in church canons. We have church canons in Trullo and Carthage 419 that says if there's any doubt as to anyone's baptism from their childhood, from the infancy, that it wasn't done and it wasn't baptized, they weren't immersed, they need to be baptized again. The church doubles down on this, does not say it doesn't matter. And so today, to get back to your question, we have that small contingent of traditional-minded people who who are not ecumenists. They don't believe the church is, here and there and this divide or anything, but they're misunderstanding or not reading properly the tradition, and they're not following this criteria, this presupposition. But I think the growing number of people, whether sometimes they don't even understand it, but they're expressing an ecclesiology which is heretical. They're expressing the ecumenistic ecclesiology, like I said earlier in the story, where they say grace is present in the heterodox mysteries and we must not baptize. Now, that is a clear expression of the heresy of ecumenism. Because then, if that's the case, you have now a divided church. You have a church that is both Orthodox and heterodox. I mean, you have a heretical church. It's not holy. It's not one anymore. And you have a church that's not necessarily has apostolic succession and apostolic faith. I mean, you have a dissolution of the dogma of the church. That's a growing number of people, and I think a lot of them are not necessarily sinister ecumenists. Like whatever that might mean. No, they're people who are bringing in the baggage from their heterodox ways and days. They're listening to a revision of some academic theologians who want us to believe that we've always recognized grace in the mysteries, especially of the Latins, and they're following it for probably a lot of times personal reasons. They've got mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters who are heterodox. They've got their own, understanding of their life before they became Orthodox as being grace-filled. They've got a variety of things that have nothing to do with what the fathers teach, right? It has to do with our own personal views, our hang-ups, our authority questions. I was received by chrismation. Don't tell me that I wasn't received properly. There's a lot of that pushback to our work or this whole question of the criteria. It has nothing to do with actually what the fathers taught. I mean, that's why I keep saying, read the book and let's not talk about secondary and tertiary issues of what did they say in Jerusalem? What did they say in Jassy? What did they say these are fine questions. Let's talk about them. But the whole picture together, we have to see the whole 2,000 year tradition and all the choir of the fathers and the canons, and not be swayed by the particular practice of this particular church since 1666, or the practice in America for the last 50 years. That's not going to get to a Orthodox consensus on this topic.
And I think an interesting thing I've heard both from a certain bishop, but also from people that be so liberal, that they've never heard of someone that regretted being baptized into the church. And so there is a pastoral aspect to this. It's fun. We can talk about these intellectual things all day, where the rubber meets the road is when we receive people in the church, we have to apply the canons in a way that's useful to those people's salvation. That's what the last canon of Trullo talks about, right? Like a doctor applying the canons.
Yes.
And so I think something that has to be at least treated with respect is that a common pastoral experience is that people eventually they start getting nagging doubts about their reception of the church, and they don't tend to have that. They've just been baptized into the church. At worst, they go, I guess that was redundant, if that's the conviction they went to. But they never feel bad about it. They don't have spiritual struggles with it. And so I do think that's something, if both liberals and conservatives both recognize, I think it kind of cuts away a lot of this intellectual haggling over really nothing as important as the fact that, well, let's apply these canons in a way which are useful for the people. And these days, we're not talking about the mass conversions of formerly Polish-occupied Ukraine and how do we get unions back to the church. We're talking about a lot of people that are disaffected Roman Catholics and Protestants that are being evangelized and converting to Orthodoxy. What helps those people be saved, right? And I think we have to look at this pastorally. So that would be my comments on that before maybe if I could trouble you with a little bit on the question of the confession of Disitheus. I don't know if you want to say anything piggybacking on that comment, though.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fine, happy to discuss it. I just don't want it to become a tangent or something we go off on and we forget the main topic. But I'm happy to discuss it. You know, the whole question, what you said, what you brought up, this does. For the vast majority of people, this is what's really important. Like, I was received, we hear this all the time. I was received by chrismation. I wanted to be baptized. They didn't baptize me. And now I have this, you know, I've spent 10 years and I still feel like something's missing. And we hear this all the time. And, you know, it's, to me, it's just, I've said this a million times. I'll say it again. And I don't think there's any answer to this. How can a priest or a bishop look somebody in the face who's saying, please baptize me, and deny that person? I mean, it just doesn't fit in the any paradigm, any explanation of the canons or the patristic mind on this topic. It just does not fit. It's clearly a distortion of our tradition and understanding. You know, there's no need, but this is where most people are, and this is what they're crying out, and they're saying, just baptize me. And I think that the first step has to be anyone who wants to be baptized must and should be accepted by baptism. There should be no discussion on this matter. And this will solve 90% of our pastoral problems overnight. Why would anybody be opposed to this? Unless they have another ecclesiology. And then we have a big problem. And I think we do have a big problem. So I think that's where we're going to see. If this was the case, if the Assembly of Bishops came out and said, look, everyone who wants baptism, we will baptize. We don't need to ask questions about how they were baptized when they were children. If it was no, we're going to, because that's the church can do that. Of course the church can do that. There would be immediately this problem would be solved. Because there would be very few people who would say, I want to be chrismated. Very few people. But there would be an outcry from the ecumenists in the church. And you're going to see this. I've heard stories already. Somebody was just telling me a story. There was a committee. Won't get into details because they didn't give me the names. But there's somebody who's very prominent academic, and they were saying, this is a problem. Somebody wanted to be baptized. He insisted, and the priest gave way, and they allowed him to be baptized. And this academic thought this was terrible. And so we have another ecclesiology here, Patrick. That's the problem. And I think that's why there's certain quarters in the church who just really don't want this book or this discussion to happen, because it's not just about, they're not coming at it as you came to, you know, what's the best for them. That's not where they're coming at. They have an agenda. They have an ecclesiology. They have a vision of the church, which is just not patristic.
Well, there is like a lost canon to Trullo that says if there's a political agenda, we can apply the canons to suit that agenda, right?
I don't think that's the only criteria, though.
No. That's a facetious question, Father.
Oh, okay. Okay. You got me. I was like, where are we going with this? Yeah, I know what you mean.
No, you're being too nice.
Let's do politics. Let's turn the church into a political. Yeah, no, that's funny.
It's more serious though. Well, let me ask kind of a secondary question, which would be, I've noticed, again, I don't get everywhere. I know that second marriages have been performed in the OCA, in the Bulgarian Patriarchate, in roll call, so they do happen. And the idea is, well, it's not that you're not married outside the church, but there's a grace in a sacramental marriage, right? And so why does that seem to be not so controversial that the, sacraments repeated, or arguably for the first time within the Orthodox Church, on the issue of marriage? It seems like every jurisdiction's on board with it.
That's a really good question. I don't have a lot of experience, but I've heard the same thing. I've heard this. There's one instance which was just mind-boggling. I mean, God bless them. I don't think they really understood the implications of what they were doing. But there was one parish where they insisted that the person be received by chrismation, but then they also insisted that they be married. And I think it just points to the total. There's no thought going here. There's no consistent theological sense of what we're doing. It would make sense, I guess, if people insisted that people be chrismated because they already believe they're baptized, then to insist they not be married. That would be at least logically consistent, right? But you're saying, no, you have people who are begging, her saying to their priests, I want to be married in the Orthodox Church. And they're saying, sure, okay, we'll marry you. But they, at the same time, are saying, no, you must not be received by baptism.
Yeah, and it doesn't attract the vitriol of like, oh, yes, it's a blasphemy, it's
yes,
to repeat this marriage. And it's like, well, no, it is dotting our I's and crossing our T's, and it's something everyone's on board with. Everyone does it.
Yes.
So it just seems to me why that is something that's not so controversial. It seemed to have the same ramifications. But
it's not as common though either. So that's possibly why it's like that. And I think that it's not as politically charged, like you said, right? They're already in the church. So now it's kind of like, well, let's just do this quietly over here in the corner. And, these people have some, I think some priests say, well, this is some psychological need of these priests, of these people. Let's just do what they need, which is really problematic because if it's a mystery of the church, we don't play with them and do it for psychological reasons or something, right? Yeah.
Now, I'm going to ask real briefly, so you don't have to get a ton of detail, but did Constantinople 1484, it's mentioned in the book, allow for the reception of Roman Catholics without rebaptism? What exactly did it decide? And did form play any role in the decision there?
Yes, very good question. So at the Council of Florence, St. Mark of Ephesus accused the papists, the papal Protestants, as I like to call them, of not following the Orthodox form of baptism, right? Aside from their heresy of the filioque, etc. One of the Unionists, who was close to the emperor, Gregory Mamas, said that he was wrong and that the Latins practiced baptism in 3 immersions. So the Latins had not completely departed universally from the form of baptism in the 3 immersions at that time. There were still portions, geographical, whatever, they were still doing it according to the form, and there was still a possibility of an economy for those who were triple immersed. So the Latins had not completely departed. St. Nicodemus and St. Athanasius Parios state that had St. Mark required that the Latins be baptized at that time, the Pope, due to his power and influence, would have raised up all the armies of Europe against the Orthodox, who were at that time in very weakened state under the Ottomans. So there was also that pastoral question after Florence: how do we deal with the Latins? And we're very weak politically. That's how St. Nicodemus and St. Athanasius explained his use of economy. Both saints said that then in the 18th century, now 300 years later, 400 years later, that this military threat had passed and there was no justification for economy in the reception of the papacy. Of course, they had departed at Trent from the form, and they had embraced, the various ways of quote unquote baptizing. So there were 2 reasons why the Holy Father said this is no longer possible, or not only not necessary, but no longer possible in the 18th century.
So essentially, what was still proper form in the 15th century, at least arguably, not in all quarters, but as far as they were aware, became squirt gun baptism a couple centuries later. It's interesting as a side note, if you read Dante's Inferno, he mentions this kind of controversy around him destroying a baptistry, and he defends himself saying, oh, a baby fell into the baptistry, so I destroyed it to save the baby who was going to drown. And so one can help but notice the whole point of the story was that baptistries were built for full immersion baptisms. Otherwise, the story makes no sense. And that he's writing in the 14th century. So a lot of people just automatically think if it's post-schism, they were automatically sprinkling all the infants, and that's not actually true. And we could, this mainstream stuff that contains these historical details. It's a nice little tidbit for those little Easter egg reading Dante.
Absolutely. There's a variety of things going on in the West. It's a long process of dissolution. And a lot of the contemporary sacramental, academic theologians looking at sacramental theology and the development in the West, they make extended analysis to show that it was this methodological step-by-step dissolution to the point where you had people getting quote-unquote baptized, and then years later they were confessed for the first time or communed for the first time, and then confirmed. And this whole process happened over centuries, this dissolution, right? So it makes perfect sense that over centuries, the universalization of pouring or sprinkling was happening, and there were still places. You could even make a case that once in a while, somewhere, a traditionalist-minded Latin, is still trying to immersing here and there. But the 1917 Code of Canon Law from in Catholicism says clearly the norm is pouring, and this is what we do. So that's what happened in Trent. They said, no, this is the norm, is what we do. So it's clear that they reached a point where there was no more, spots here and there doing different things, where they wanted to standardize it. And they standardized it away from Holy Tradition and away from triple immersion.
Now, let me ask this question ever so briefly. The book takes a critical view, at least in tone, the councils of Yassi and the Council of Jerusalem. They're both 17th century councils. They've been received by the episcopacies of the time and into the modern era. Now, these councils, something I was just reading this week in St. Justin Popovich's Orthodox Dogmatics, where he speaks about how these councils have dogmatic authority, but he actually makes the comment that in as much as they are consistent with the ecumenical councils. So your book criticizes these councils for, being Latin oriented. I mean Latin, the theology, and actually literally written in Latin, by the way. These councils were written both Latin and Greek on purpose. So they had definite Latin influence, intentionally so during that time. But it seems that the councils, other than how they sound, the book details that particularly the Council of Jerusalem requires correct form in baptism. So my question is, then, why is this council really divisive on this question if it presumes upon correct form? It would just be allowing correct economy in the reception of people with correct form. I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Well, I think that's the point that we try to make, and the point that needs to be made is that it's wrongly understood on that particular point, Decree 15 of the 1672 Council. We focus on this because it's largely been mistranslated and misinterpreted to suggest that heretics shouldn't be received by baptism. If this was the case, and it's not the case, it would have been rejected on the basis of contradicting the ecumenical councils. And so, yeah, we would agree with St. Justin, of course, that insofar as it doesn't depart from the ecumenical councils, then we can accept it. That seems to be rather obvious, right? That's our standard. And everything that's happening since 1666 and the council which introduced in Russia chrismation and did away with the 500-year tradition of the Russian Church of baptizing Latins. From that point forward, you have a long period that is universally acknowledged as a period of Latinization, of Western captivity, according to Father George Florovsky. That this whole period is colored by Latin theology. They were learning in Latin in Ukraine. They even St. Nicodemus is accused of somehow being influenced by this Latinization. We have to make some distinctions. as you said, and we would agree with that. You have heavily Latinized in style and language. Doesn't mean the essence of their dogmatic decisions are Latin oriented necessarily. Saint Nicodemus is accused of this, but if you have a proper Orthodox reading of Saint Nicodemus, yes, the terminology is borrowed from the West, but the meaning is actually not the Western meaning. For instance, when they're talking about penances and how he understands penances, is not the Western meaning, it's the Orthodox meaning. So you really need to read them properly, understanding the context, understanding the dogmatic mind of the church, recognizing where it does adopt Latinized style, language, etc., recognizing where it departs, if it departs from the ecumenical councils, accepting what's consistent with the ecumenical councils, and then I think it's fine. I don't think we have this. There's not a huge crisis here with these councils, but when we take them and we run with them and we try to, prove that they're adopting Latin theology, then I think we have a problem, right? That's not an Orthodox reading.
Yeah, I think the issue would be to take what's less clear from, let's say, a more recent tradition and overturn the ancient consensus tradition on that basis, instead of looking at the more recent tradition as harmonizing somehow with the tradition that precedes it. Because if it's not from antiquity, it couldn't be legitimate. So I think there's a methodological error there, and I also think there's a lack of attention to detail in what the council actually says on baptism, Jerusalem specifically.
Yes.
Now, how about the encyclical of the patriarchs in 1755? You touched on this. Now, they started requiring baptism in the correct form. They were no longer going to accept Roman Catholic baptisms. What was the big push behind this at that time?
Yeah, this is really important. The three council or the encyclical of the three patriarchs, which was later, by the way, embraced by the Patriarch of Antioch, who was not there. So basically, we have all four patriarchs in the East embracing this decision in the 18th century, 1755, supported, by the way, by Saint Auxentius, who was the spiritual father of Patriarch Kirill. People often forget that we have saints that are behind these decisions. Very important for us. But after the Council of Trent in the 16th century, both papal and Reformed Protestants in the West universally had departed from the apostolic practice of baptism and three immersions in the name of the Trinity. So the 1755 Council or cyclical is called after the Latins made significant inroads in the Roman territories, right? The former Roman Empire in Asia Minor and in modern Greece. And they succeed in getting many Orthodox priests and bishops to pledge allegiance to the Pope. We have the amazing story, I think it should be told, maybe not get into tonight, but the 1666 Council was ruled over by the Patriarch of Antioch, who was basically a hidden unit, and he was serving the interests of the Pope, and that's a lot of why he wanted to change the practices in Russia. Well, this was going on in different places in the East at the time. There was a threat within the Orthodox Church that they were going to be overturning the mind among clergy with this and pledging allegiance to the Pope, etc. So there was an understanding that the lax policies in reception and a distorted ecclesiology were intertwined. So there was a need to insist that all heretics be received by baptism because they were heretics, because they didn't even practice baptism, which is by three immersions by definition. And because when this standard is placed to the side, what happens is the boundaries of the church become very unclear, and they lead to ecclesiological confusion. They lead to all kinds of problems. So the church was basically saying, for a variety of reasons, they're heretics. The practice has been abandoned in the West. This is universally practiced. We need to revert to Acrivia. It's not possible to economize.
Now, you say it's not possible to economize because in that instance, we're dealing with improper form. Now, we touched on this throughout the interview. How is this all a pastoral judgment call? Especially concerning confusion over the efficacy of sacraments outside the church, whether apply Acrivia or economia. Where do you think the church should be going from here? Because you wrote this book, you've made your case, you need proper form, right? When the situation calls for it, we should be following Acrivia. That's the case of your book. But
But that's also what St.
How about
Benedict
we get
did.
into the pastoral judgment call of heeding what the book says?
There's a lot of things we could talk about in this area, and it's a big question. I think this is what, hopefully this book will provoke this kind of discussion and serious consideration and eventually a consensus among the Orthodox. We're just one little publishing company, few people here. We're trying to present this to the church. We want the church to deal with it. That means the priests and bishops and the whole people of God. They have to consider these matters seriously, and then consider that and this is our case, that this is a matter that is existential. It's so important to the life of the church. It's so important to the life of every convert. It's part and parcel of a full and proper catechism. It is the foundation of the life of the person going forward. If this is wrong, if we get this wrong and we're receiving people by chrismation, there's no basis for it because the form is not there, because there's no necessity. People are begging for baptism and all the rest. If we get this wrong, we're setting off the whole mission of the church is being established on a faulty foundation, both generally and for the particular person that's being initiated. It's of extreme importance for a missionary church to get this right and to follow the fathers. So yes, we understand now this book is a provocation to many because we've had this practice going back decades, if not longer, maybe even hundreds of years in some places. And so we're, questioning the status quo. But the cornerstone of the Christian life is that we're constantly repenting. We're constantly reorienting toward Christ. We're constantly doubting ourselves, right? And calling and our spiritual father and the church fathers and the saints are putting a mirror before us and saying, "Are you on the right path?" This is basic and natural in the life of the church for this to happen, and for a book or for a personality, whatever, to come and say, "Look, we should reconsider this." And we should seriously reconsider it and discuss it. And there's no reason for us to become antagonistic and to become angry and to call people names and to do ad hominems. If we're doing that, it just shows that we're threatened and that we're not responding in an orthodox manner. Maybe what I see happening many times, which is really unfortunate. I hope this is not going to be the case going forward, is that instead of actually addressing the matter at hand, the topic, the fathers, the case being made, we're addressing tertiary and secondary matters, or we're engaged in ad hominem, and we're doubling down on our authority. Like we're threatened, our authority is threatened, our decision making in the past is threatened, and so now we're going to strike out and say, this is illegitimate, or this person's illegitimate, or this book is illegitimate. That would be a tragedy if that happened, because it doesn't have to do anything with us. That's one of the reasons why we didn't put our names on the book, right? The three authors are not mentioned intentionally, not because we're afraid of the book. I mean, it's still Orthodox Ethos publication. It's an Uncommon Press book. We're not afraid of the book. We've been talking about it, for years, but we don't want this to be about the authors. We want it to be about the fathers, the saints. We don't want ad hominems. That's just a distraction. So I would say, let's consider the case being made. We need to go back to the patristic tradition and the standard of the ecumenical councils. And we need to be Florovsky came in the 30s and said, and this was really fought by a lot of people in the Russian church at the time. He said, there has been a Western captivity. And he laid it out, right? What was missing in his critique was that a part of this Western captivity was the Latinization of our sacramental theology and our understanding of baptism. And it's very clear in our book. We make a very strong case that from the 17th century on, especially 1666, we've got another trajectory, not just in the Russian church, but in many parts of the Orthodox Church. There's a new trajectory, a new understanding of baptism, no longer triple immersion, a new understanding of the presuppositions for economy, a new understanding of the nature of the church that's entering in. And it's all because of this Latinization, this Westernization. And so, I think our book, if not literally, because unfortunately Florovsky took another position on the limits, he engaged in this speculation of Augustinian theology and how it could work in ecumenism. But at the same time, as you remember, he did say, look, Cyprian's the standard, never been overturned. So it's always curious when people ignore that in that article. But the Florovskys, opened up and said, we've got to seriously look at some of these practices and say, do they agree with the fathers and with the ecumenical councils? And I think a lot of what we're talking about today is either directly under the influence of ecumenism or a result of this Latinization, this Westernization. And we've it's hard. It's hard to go look in the mirror and say, yeah, this was a problem. We need to correct course. But it's going to have to be many priests and many bishops, genuinely discussing, debating, and examining this and giving it its due. And, ultimately it's in the hands of the church generally. We're just one little contribution, one little publishing house trying to do our part to stay true to the fathers and follow the Holy Fathers. That's what we're trying to do here.
Now, is your book in back order? Did it sell so many copies, or is this a evil rumor to prevent you from selling books?
Say that again.
It says that someone's saying they hear the books in back order.
No. It's available right now. We've got plenty of copies in our distribution house in Texas.
Oh, so there you go. It's in stock. Go get it. I do want to piggyback this comment ad hominems. Like, yes, there's a very rare time and place to, be like Christ and with cords, purify the temple by getting rid of everyone. But if you're doing that all the time with everything, it's like the boy that cried wolf. And that sort of modus operandi is just not Christian. And so it's okay to disagree. In fact, the side that's wrong should be proved wrong. The side that's right should prevail. But we ought to act like Christians when working these things out. Those who want to shut down conversation tend to be the wrong side, which is why they seek to shut down conversation. They don't think the merits of their case will win the day. It's the same old cancel culture. So whoever you see trying to cancel the other side, they're the wrong side, especially these days, because we're not in a theocratic state.
I don't think it has any place in the Orthodox Church. There's no place in the Orthodox Church for cancel culture, for banning of books, for banning of priests. This is worldly. It's anathema in the Orthodox Church. And if you're engaged in it, it just shows that you have no basis, patristic. You don't have the ethos, that's for sure. And you probably don't have the patristic mind either. So I really hope that that's not going to be what we're going to see going forward. And I hope we have a really robust exchange. I'm looking forward to, I've already got invited on one podcast of a prominent cleric, and I'm looking forward to going on that. And we're going to have a lot of more discussions going forward. I think we're going to be graced with the presence of Father John Whiteford in our podcast in the near future. We've got several podcasts set up for the rest of the month. So let's talk about it. Let's examine it. Why not? This is what the church is for. The church is conciliar. This idea that we're going to just, I'm sorry, but there's two extremes in the church that you see going on. And usually, unfortunately, because we don't have the context of a healthy Orthodox culture, but we're coming from Protestant and papal, Reformed Protestant and papal Protestant extremes. Immediately, when you say, let's discuss this, you'll hear somebody say, that's just for the bishops, and you're being a Protestant, which is, to me, it just points to this person. The person has that as
But when the bishop wants to discuss this, then he can be attacked by the laity, and that's okay. Right? It's a one-way street. So it's not just a discussion for the bishops. The bishops make the decision, but the guardians of the faith are the bishops and the laity. That's what Constantinople 1848 even says. So it's something that everyone's involved.
Everyone's involved, especially when it's dogmatic issues. Of course, a dogmatic issue. And this is a dogmatic question, ultimately. It's about the church, the nature of the church, the identity of the church, the identity of a Christian, what it means to be a Christian. All of these things are touched on in the book. So this is absolutely for everyone to consider and suggest and to know our faith. This touches on basic dogmatic matters that are threatened today. The dogma of the church, one holy Catholic of the church, one baptism. These are matters that we confess every day in the creed. The idea that this is only for bishops to discuss is just not Orthodox. You're either, at that point, you're either a papal-minded Orthodox, and you want, I don't know where this idea comes from. Like you have no part to play. It's
an inconsistent idea because, there's it exists, but there's bishops that are in favor of left-leaning blogs, and they're not written by bishops. So there's two sides to this, and the idea is there needs to be a real dialogue. Not we need to have a dialogue, and that's code word for you shut up and you listen to what I have to say. There needs to be a real dialogue, and the truth needs to prevail. Yeah. And so let me see, Father, do you have some time for some audience questions?
Sure.
Now,
Absolutely.
Before we do that, I want to get your plugs, because I don't want people to tune out for the questions are answered. So, Father, if you give any plugs about what you're doing in Orthodox Ethos, anything new on Coming Out and Press, if you don't mind doing some plugs right now.
Absolutely. And I hope everybody supports your channel and your work in the mission field, which is really quite wonderful. I'm really glad to see you doing that. We've been considering that. We had a missionary friend, beloved priest, who proposed in the mission field. We were about to start collecting money for his work in West Africa. So I really applaud you on that. Our work is, we've got a number of, angles online. Of course, Orthodox Ethos, very excited that we've reached over 55,000 on Instagram and 53 or 4,000 on YouTube. People tuning in, mostly non-Orthodox. There's some people out there who say, the Orthodox Ethos, you shouldn't go to them for catechism, or you shouldn't go to them for, they're not good for catechism. There's some people who are saying that. And I just kind of laugh at that, because the vast majority of people who are tuning into our live streams are not Orthodox. And I got tons of people writing me. Every week I've got at least 2 people writing me saying, you're one of the channels that I viewed and brought me into the church. So Orthodox Ethos is doing missionary work, even as we're talking about these topics, because non-Orthodox or people who are Orthodox, they're not interested in some idealist fake vision of the church. They love the fact that we're real and we're talking about matters, truthfully and honestly. That's one of the reasons that people often comment and say, we appreciate the frankness, the directness, the fearlessness, whatever they, see us doing. And I think that's the culture of the church. The culture of the church is we're engaged in that, and we're not afraid at all. And we're interested in the truth, love the truth, and we're just out there stating it as it is. And people love that, and they embrace that. They know that we're in an age of compromise and relativism, and they're not coming here with some rose-colored glasses that we're all saints. They understand that we're struggling with the world and all the rest. So we're excited that there's so many non-Orthodox who are following our work, and they're interested in our work and coming to the church because of it. That's just tremendously encouraging. Our publishing work on Come Out and Press is exploding. This book, as I said, over 1,300 books sold in the first 10 days. And we've got tons of more books coming out. I want to talk about some of the books coming out, and you're going to look forward to in the next 3 to 6 months. Orthodox Patristic Witness Concerning Catholicism, 800 pages, 350 pages about the collection of all the Synaxaria and all the lives of the saints that have anything to do with Catholicism, the martyrs, the confessors, the church fathers, and then hundreds of pages of church patristic, conciliar, and patristic decisions and texts on Catholicism. So why are we doing this? We're doing this because the authoritative voice of the church on these dogmatic questions, especially with regard to the various heretical or heterodox groups, is from the saints. The saints teach us, the saints guide us, we follow them. Today we have, unfortunately, a whole class of academic theologians and bishops who are speaking for the church, talking about their idea of what Catholicism is, and they're not following the Holy Fathers. They're not following the church teachings of the conciliar decisions. They're talking about 2 lungs. They're talking about 1 baptism. All of this is nowhere to be found in the patristic witness. And so I wanted a book. We've been working on this for several years. It's been taking a lot of hours of research. I mean, we've translated fresh stuff from Greece. Greek's never been in English. I wanted a book in 1 volume where you can say, what does the Orthodox Church teach about Catholicism? Here it is, the authoritative voice of the saints, the conciliar decisions, the church fathers for the last 1,000 years, historical events, etc. So that's coming out hopefully by, I would say, maybe October in the best case scenario. We have a yearbook that's coming out, God willing, by November. It's already in page layout. and we're really excited about that. The rise and fall of the papacy, extremely well-researched, academic, and footnotes galore. First 1,000 years, century by century. How did the papacy rise and then fall away from orthodoxy? Another book that's in the works is The Errors of the Latins, which is a companion volume, I would say, to the first one I talked about, the Orthodox Church Witness, and it's a collection of all the Latin texts, the Latin errors, the Latin positions, the false decretals, etc., etc. It's going to be one volume encyclopedia. So if you're a interested Roman Catholic, you say, well, I'm interested in Orthodoxy. These two books, which hopefully will be out in 3 to 6 months, are going to be 2 volumes, along with The Rise and Fall of the Papacy, along with The Papacy by Abel Goutet and other books like this. You're going to have just tons of material to pour over and to consider the case for Orthodoxy. And so that's really exciting. That's in the near future. We've also got a work by Saint Ephrem, the Syrian, that we're translating. We have a work by Dorotheos Voulas-Mas on baptism that we're translating. We have a book by Father Theodore Zisis, the Kolivadis Fathers, we're translating. We've got tons of translation works going on simultaneously. We're also engaged in a lot of interviews. We've done a number of interviews in Greek that are being translated and are going to be coming out soon in English on the very important question of authority in the church and the conciliar nature of the church. Interviews I did in Greece when I was there that are being done. We're also working on a new documentary that we're going to go public in hopefully about a month with a big fundraiser. What is a Christian? It's going to be a very big project, biggest project we've ever done. It's going to cost a lot of money, but it's going to be, hopefully, God willing, out in about a year is what I'm hoping. We'll see what we can do. But what is a Christian? And it will be a journey through with interviews from Protestants, Roman Catholics, atheists, Jews, Muslims, you name it. We're going to interview a whole swath of people. What is a Christian? And of course, the answer will be given by the church fathers, the saints, at the end of the day. And that's a project that we're going to begin shortly. We're also talking about 2 conferences in the near future. We want to do a conference on the 8th Ecumenical Council under St. Photios. We're translating fresh material, divine service for the feast, and that's coming up. We're trying to nail down dates for that. And on the Kolivadis Fathers, hopefully we also have that and a service translated and chantable for the Kolivadis Fathers. So a lot going on in Orthodox ethos in Underground Press.
Now, my plug is going to be for the churches in Cambodia. I showed this last week. Here's my plaque and grad. Nothing more official than a plaque, right?
Nice.
But this plaque is really not me, guys. This plaque is for what all of the supporters of this show do in donating to the churches in Cambodia, the missionary work there. OrthodoxChristianTheology.com/donate. So please, a lot of people, we've had some very big documentaries and shows recently. Please show your support by donating to the missionary work. Because what's the point of this if we're not building up the church?
Absolutely.
So, $1, $10, hundreds of dollars, whatever the amount, always appreciated. Also pray for the missionary work, both there and also Lydia Luke is supporting it in Granada. So that's something we've had Father Ambrosi in Granada on the show as well. So please support the missionary work. This channel always supports Cambodia specifically financially. So please, OrthodoxChristianTheology.com/donate. Please donate if this has blessed you. Now, we're going to now get into some audience questions. And some will be short, and we'll just ask dismissively and then answer dismissively, and some will be longer. So this is the time if you have any questions to ask now. We have this from Alexander. Can Father Peter give an example when he would economize and won't baptize a heterodox? A practical example of a reason for economy. So, like, Father, you as a priest, could you think of any example where you wouldn't follow Acrivia and just actually permit the, if you're a priest making the decision, the economic canon to be followed?
The vast majority of examples from church history, before I get to maybe a theoretical possible example today, when you look at, for instance, in the 4th century and St. Basil, most of the cases seem to be, at least in the 4th century, people who are already baptized in the church. So that's obviously forbidden for us to baptize those because they are baptized by the church. In those cases where it's unclear to us if they were in the same generation or if they're coming later, there was some need that was determined, probably because you had a large group and they really wanted to bring this to an end as quickly as possible. And the heretics themselves consider themselves already a part of the church. They had an arrogance and a pride, maybe we can't accept that we're not baptized, etc. And the local hierarchy said, for the sake of putting an end to this grievous, poisonous schism or heresy, they judged they would economize because the form was present in the vast majority of heretics. The Arians, only the Eunomians, which specifically are stated in Canon 7, did not have the form. They had intentionally innovated with regard to the baptism, and so they were rejected. So the church saw that to bring an end to these grievous schisms, but they were usually large groups. On an individual basis, it's hard to imagine any need for economy. If there is proper catechism and a patience and a full initiation into the life of the church, especially in today's Catholicism, I don't see why anyone would not be able to say, yes, of course I want to be baptized, knowing that they were never baptized. In other words, immersed, because that's what baptism means. I think pastorally, the priests, if they're patient and they teach the faith and they're living vibrantly the life, I think it's very rare that any priest would need to economize. But again, according to the fathers, you cannot economize if there's not a form there to work with. So the 99% of the heterodox today, it's not up to the priest to economize if you follow the Holy Fathers. It's not possible. It's not blessed. And the fact that they're doing it is that they're not following the patristic tradition. So if there was, I can try to imagine, well, when would I might economize? First of all, that's not the way it's done. It's done with much prayer and pain of heart. And God illumines you and says, well, this is exceptional. The presuppositions exist. And this person, needs this economy to be brought into the church. Again, on a personal one-to-one level, this is very, very rare. I don't see why it would be necessary. But if there would be, the presuppositions would be met, and there would be some exceptional circumstance in their life that would justify it. And you would say, in this case, and I can't imagine anything right now, but there would be something. There would be just a really unique case. Like the person would be thrown out of his house. I don't know. He would be, who knows? There would be some impossibility if he goes back to he might be in a community where he's alone. There's no Orthodox Church anywhere around him. He's far away from any Orthodox Church, and everyone around him is very antagonistic. And if he becomes Orthodox and they learn that he's baptized, he might be, I don't know, lose his job, or I don't know. There'd have to be some really exceptional thing, and the church would say, well, since the presuppositions exist, we can economize for the sake of this particular case. But the departure from Orthodox patristic standard today is so vast and so common that it's really hard. You're very hard pressed to justify economy today.
I mean, I think an obvious example, which may not be totally rare, would be someone marrying like a union, or an Oriental Orthodox would be more common with the Arabs, where, for some reason it can create divisiveness within the marriage, or it's a remarriage and there's children and whatever. As long as correct form has been followed, I think the obvious, and I'm not a priest, I'm a bishop, so I'm speaking to some schmuck on YouTube, guys. I can see some obvious pastoral need there, as long as, the criteria is met for economy. And so, in the real world, we do get stuff like that. So I think that's, if Alexandra was asking the question almost rhetorically, saying, oh, there's no situation where, someone may be taking the views of the book would accept this.
You're saying a union because they've maintained the form, they're actually immersing?
Some. Remember, there's those in the Orthodox Church that don't even do that.
Yeah, right.
Right.
I think a lot of unions have been Latinized on that. as do many today, unfortunately. But
Yeah, because that's another thing too. The Uniates, it depends where they are, but like, because they are being increasingly Latinized, but like, let's say a Melke, right? They tend to be the most antithetical to Latinizing within the Uniate umbrella.
This question of form is the hardest for a lot of people to receive because there's been almost a universal idea that it doesn't matter, and that if you insist on it, you're legalistic. And I think we need to address this, fully in a future podcast, because it's, just to show in the book, it's very clear that there's so many witnesses to the matter that baptism means immersion. And if you got to get cured, as it were, from this illness in the mind that baptism is anything but immersion. But we've been brainwashed because it's so vast, and the Latins and the practice has been even accepted among many Orthodox, that it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter if it's sprinkling or pouring, or that these things are inconsequential. But the canons and the fathers are very clear that is not considered baptism by the canons and by the fathers in the church. And so we've got it's a huge uphill battle to just get people back to square one, to the 0 point, and for them to say, well, wait a minute, this is actually what it means to be baptized. A lot of people just think, well, this is legalistic. It's just legalistic. The fathers are legalistic.
I was interrupting.
Yeah, no, that's all right. That's it.
So how about here's a question: why don't we use living water to baptize? Right, like, so the Didache gives this hierarchy. Yeah. And so Didache alone was the authority. That means we shouldn't really have baptistries. I mean, we're not in the middle of the desert, most of us. I mean, what say you?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think that it's been standardized across the world because of convenience, and not because of trying to keep the tradition in terms of at least the Didache. It's not hard in many places in the United States to find rivers. Father Seraphim Rose has a famous, wonderful picture where he's baptizing in the rivers near the monastery of Platina, and they went down and did it in the rivers. And I think that's great. If you can do it and it's nearby, that's preferable.
Now, I have a question because I'm not sure the answer. It's, from what I'm aware, right, the child's baptized after 40 days, and the mother's, church should give prayers before she can re-enter the church and all that after the 40 days. So it's pretty much they coincide at the same time. But I've noticed that in Greek churches, they do these churching prayers for the children, and they seem to delay the baptism. Is that some sort of what is that? Is that a later innovation of sorts?
That's a very recent innovation. I mean, if you go back just 50 years, 100 years to the villages in most of Greece, baptisms were happening before the 40th day. And the reason they were happening before the 40th day is because children died from sicknesses and all the rest. So many times the mothers weren't even present at the baptism. And in the village where I was a priest for 12 years, I heard stories from my church wardens and others when they were children. They would the baptism would happen before the 40th day. The mother was not present, and the children would vie who would reach the house, because everybody was in the same village. Who would reach the house first with the news of the name of the child? Because of course the name was given by the sponsor, by the anavakos, and not by the mother. So they would race to the mother's house, burst into the door, and they would say, the name of the child, because she wasn't even present at the baptism. This was the norm, pre-World War II, at least in a lot of places in rural Greece. Yeah, I think it's a real problem when you delay the baptism, especially anywhere past 6 months. The further you get away, the harder it is to do a proper baptism. You see these children 2, 3, 4 years old, and they won't get in. And you have these tiny little baptistries, and you're trying to get these huge children into the tiny baptistry. It's obviously not what the ideal is, not what we do.
And that's why, someone said that someone should send this book to Patriarch of Georgia. They baptized 500 babies with pouring. Not really, which this commenter then admitted. When they get too big for the infant baptistries, which infants grow up very fast, they kind of improvise. And in Georgia, these are mass baptisms. They do tons of them, hundreds in a day, thousands in a day. And so sometimes pure practicality takes over. They literally can't fit the kid in, or they're just doing it so fast because doing one child after another. It's just what they do in Georgia ever since the fall of communism. So it's kind of celebratory in that effect.
Well, they were affected by the kind of Latinization that happened in the Church of Russia. They were, under the Church of Russia for a long time. But I would also say there's this weird thing you've seen in the Georgian baptisms where they're putting their feet in and then they're turning around and putting their forehead in. Have you seen this? The baby's going back and forth 3 times. I don't know where they get this. I see the same thing in Bulgaria in some places where they're putting the people's feet in the water and then they're pouring water over the forehead or over the head. I'm just sprinkling it. These kind of ideas, whatever they are, I have no idea where they're coming from. They cannot be justified or reconciled with the canonical and patristic tradition. I mean, it's not my decision. It's not up to me. I'm just telling you as a witness to what we've understand and what we've researched, that's not reconcilable. So yeah, we are in the church, obviously suffering from the long process of disorientation with regard to what a baptism is and the buying in to strange ideas of what a baptism is. It's not just outside the body of Christ, it's in the church. And I think again that is a testimony to the rule that if the form is not present, we cannot economize. When we start economizing with the form not present, we end up changing our practice over time. We start viewing it as something other than 3 immersions. I think this is proven today around the Orthodox world. It's not from the fathers, though. It's not from the saints. The saints didn't teach this.
Now, someone has this question. Why does the earliest Christian artwork depict baptism standing in the river having water poured? Like, you even see these like baptisms of Christ and icons. What's the deal with that?
Well, we see him in the water and he's being immersed. I think people think that they assume it's being poured on him. That's not the ones I've seen. He's actually in the water halfway up. The image, the icon cannot depict him being immersed, but the hand is over him, like on our book, right? The hand is over him, and it's understood that he's going to be immersed. Some people think that means he's just going to be partially immersed. I don't know. So I don't think that the iconic the tradition of the holy icons going back thousands of years supports the idea of pouring. Some icons, sure, there's always exceptions.
Now, someone asked this question, and oops, clicking the wrong button. Hope I didn't put that user sign out. If so, it's by mistake. Now, they have something about the Council Trullo, the reception of Trullo's canons and the Eighth Ecumenical Council. That really isn't the topic tonight. I'll just say briefly that Trullo's canons are accepted by Canon 1 of Nicaea II, and Canon 1 of Nicaea II is accepted as part of Nicaea II. So that kind of pretty much settles that. It really shouldn't be a debate. The Eighth Ecumenical Council, accepted by Rome, well, the canons of that council in 879 to 880 are even in Evo charts and certain papal partisans. So that's also part of the early, even schismatic tradition of the West. So that's pretty much that. Whatever like reinventing of their tradition has occurred since then is kind of really irrelevant to us. Now, someone asked, is it not sacrilegious to baptize multiple times? And again, the argument of St. Dionysius of Alexandria and St. Cyprian is we're not baptizing someone again, we're baptizing them for the first time. Just like the water gun baptism, do you think if that child was baptized since, then, and it wasn't with the water gun, would he consider that a second baptism, or that the water gun wasn't a baptism, right? So that's kind of the thought process behind that.
Saint Cyril of Jerusalem, who has the famous catechesis, he was present at the Second Ecumenical Council, and he says in his catechesis that we baptize heretics because what the heretics do is no baptism at all. So you have a church father, one of the greatest catechists, or at least the texts come down to us is considered one of the great catechetical texts of the church, and he's at the Second Ecumenical Council, which has Canon 7, which has economia for some heretics, it has Acrivia for the Eunomians, and yet in his catechesis, it's the Saint Cyprian, Saint Basil, the tradition of the church. There is no baptism among the heretics. So clearly he didn't view it as a second baptism, right? We confess one baptism. That doesn't just mean non-repetition. It means also the one baptism that Paul talks about, right? One faith, one Lord, one baptism. That's also referring to the church. The very theology of the church and baptism points to this. What is baptism? Initiation into the church. How are you initiated into the church among heterodox or heretics? You're not. Otherwise, we have a divided church. The mysteries are indivisible. They're one mystery that represent the mystery of the incarnation, the mystery of salvation, the mystery of the church. When you talk about baptism, you automatically immediately talk about the Eucharist. Why? Because baptism happens in the Eucharistic assembly. All the mysteries do, whether physically present or not. It's understood that the context for every mystery is the Eucharistic assembly. And it was for the longest time, and still is in some places. During the divine liturgy, we have baptism, and that's where we should return if we want to go back to the ancient tradition. So everything points to there being one baptism, it being the baptism of the church. Whatever happens among heterodox, it doesn't count as the one baptism. So there is never a rebaptism. People talk about, I had one priest write me yesterday, well, there's a real problem. You're talking about rebaptism. There is never rebaptism. The question is, when someone, even among the Orthodox, because this is in the canons, if you read the canons of the church, it says if the person's not immersed, he needs to be immersed. So the church themselves, in the church, let alone with the heterodox, considers baptism only one thing. What? Triple immersion. That's what the canons witness to. We've departed from that because we followed the Latins. We followed Aquinas. Not everyone, but some among the Orthodox. That needs to be corrected if we're going to be following the Holy Fathers. So there's only one baptism. It's the baptism into the church, of the church, and it's inseparable from the Eucharist. It's inseparable from the Orthodox faith. You confess the faith before you're baptized, right? I believe in one God. You're confessing the Orthodox faith. So again, a presupposition of the one baptism is the Orthodox faith. Right there in the baptismal service, it points to the presupposition being the Orthodox faith being confessed. So, I mean, there's no one is talking about rebaptism in any case, whether it's heterodox coming in or someone who's improperly been received and needs to be properly baptized. In every case, we're talking about baptism. The problem is we've redefined what it means, and we've followed Aquinas and not the Church Fathers.
I mean, on that note, Alan Brule asked, how can there be a Western captivity? And just to contextualize this, you mentioned Florovsky, and I forget, there's a saint that's quoted in the book how he talks about how errors get introduced, and then even saints, following how they were taught by their teachers, repeat the errors, just being faithful pupils. And so
St. Barsanuphius and John talk about that in their writings, yeah.
Yeah, so like it's an idea. I'm not a fan of it personally, because in full disclosure, I'm not a fan of the Western captivity thesis. The point is, saints do talk about it, and so we have to talk about it with respect. But do you mind maybe summarizing what that view is specifically, Father?
Well, I mean, this is Florovsky's term, right? And so he's pretty serious academic theologian. It's not Father Peter talking. Now you might take issue. There's parts of it that I take issue with. There's parts of it that Father Seraphim Rose and St. John and others take issue with. It can be excessive. It can become destructive if we go through and we want to cleanse everything and all the rest. I think that's excessive. But I think there needs to be a recognition that we were influenced in our academic theology. Now it's very clear in our patristic and ascetic theology, we were not influenced by the West. But in our academic theology, in the seminaries, among certain Latinizing and Westernizing thinkers and teachers, we were heavily influenced by Latin theology from the 17th century, at least the 17th century through the 18th and 19th centuries. And it left a mark on our own understanding of some of these matters, sacramental theology and ecclesiology. But St. Paisios Veloskovsky is a great example of where we were not influenced. He went to Ukraine. He went to the same Kievian, environment that Metropolitan Peter Mogila was. And he turned around and left. And he went to Mount Athos. and he went deep into the hesychastic tradition. He, of course, helped produce the Philokalia, and he was one of the greatest patristic, monastic fathers and teachers in the church in the 18th century and early 19th century in Romania. And he basically brought back to Russia, everybody I think agrees on this, the whole tradition of the Philokalia and the hesychastic tradition, which then brought flowering to Optina, Valam, and is commemorated by many saints in the 19th century in Russia. So here you see a great example of the Orthodox Church is found in the saints. We follow the fathers. They were not, even if they used, like St. Nicodemus, some terminology, they borrowed it because that was the way people were talking in the time. He was not Latinized in his thinking. He was not Westernized. So there was no Western captivity among the saints. Nobody could claim that. I don't claim that. That's nonsense. So it coexisted, and it coexists to this very day. I think you can see this in, I mean, I'm going to maybe step on some toes here, but I think it's kind of common knowledge, at least in Rocor, that in Jordanville, they certainly see themselves following the hesychastic patristic tradition that had been brought from St. Paisios and the Optina Fathers and Valam and St. Hilarion Trotsky and Metropolitan Anthony Krapavitsky all the way up to today. They consciously see themselves as following that Athonite, root and their branches of that deep tradition. And they don't see themselves following what Bishop Luke and others are characterized as a kind of Western Latin sacramental theology and ecclesiology that's still prominent among certain writers and thinkers in Russia today. That's right there in the Russian tradition. So it's not a Russian Greek thing. It's not even a Western Eastern thing. It's very particular ideas and teachings that were brought in. I mean, Metropolitan Peter Mogila apparently endorsed the idea of purgatory or of original sin or of other teachings. I'm not an expert on that, but that seems to be common knowledge. And so what do we call that?
He was censured on purgatory in the introduction to his catechism, but which was received by the whole church is the version that modified purgatory from it.
So there you go. The church itself saw this as a problem and kind of rooted it out.
And to St. Peter's credit, he delivered the edited version back to Ukraine. So it seems to have taken his correction, at least on some level.
So that's how I would explain the Western captivity. Is that agreeable or not? I don't know. We can talk about that. Let's debate it. I don't know. But that's how I understand it.
So we have this, which I'll just answer. When will Patriarch Dositheus be canonized? Maybe you could tell me, Shining Diamond. I'm not aware of any real grassroots push for Dositheus of Jerusalem to be canonized. And I think that the people that float the idea, like what my guest in the show, Peter Pechkov, is people like how they like the Latinized language. I do too. It's very succinct in what he summarizes. But I'm not sure if that's the only basis in which we would canonize someone. I'd be very much open to correction. I'll be presenting soon on the Orthodox Meme Squad the history of Orthodox indulgences, and Patriarch Dositheus figures into this quite considerably, actually. So there's like, if you go canonize the guy, it's great. You like the confession, and it's been received by the church. But there's other aspects of his episcopacy that I don't think people are aware because they haven't read on it. They just want him to be a saint because I guess it makes it easier or something like that. But I'd be very open to correction to find out the holiness of his life or just other things he's done. He certainly is held with incredible respect by St. Nicodemus. He's quoted all the time in the rhetoric. So Dositheus was one of the greatest Orthodox minds of his time and was still considered such about 100 years afterwards when the rudder was written. So I'm not saying this to minimize Dositheus. I think this is something, it's not as simple as he's smart, therefore he should be canonized. I think there needs to be a little more consideration that, but I just don't know enough about it. Maybe there is more and people...
I don't think every great thinker, patriarch is not canonized. Doesn't mean they're not a great authority for the church. Balsamon and others were never canonized, and yet we read their commentary. So, it's not. doesn't mean that he doesn't have a very notable place in Orthodox theology just because he's not canonized.
Well, Father, this has been a great interview. I think we unpacked a lot of stuff that is not only from the book, but gives some shades of gray that maybe people would miss from the book. And so I'm really grateful you've taken the time to answer the questions and to unpack this for us. So let me give my thanks on behalf of the audience.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Patrick. I really appreciate your diligence and your perseverance in struggling after going deeper, presenting the Orthodox Christian theological tradition, and having us on and supporting our work as well. We're grateful, and I think this is the kind of exchange that needs to happen across the board. I know that we don't have to, and we don't necessarily agree on everything. We're human beings. That's okay. It's not a big deal. But the essentials we do, of course. But there's going to be details. But this is the kind of discussion we have to have. Let me add one last thing I forgot to say, and that is that coming up on the feast on the new calendar here for the Dormition, that is Tuesday. We're going to have a 1-day 15% off everything across the board at Uncut Mountain Press. So if you haven't bought the book and you want to buy it, wait till Tuesday. You get a 15% discount on everything on Orthodox on Uncut Mountain Press. That's coming up on the feast on the new calendar. So
you just killed your sales for the next 36 hours, man.
What's that?
You just killed your sales for the next 36 hours.
That's all right. I want people to come to the site and get what they need. That's important.
Well, it's guys. There you go. Go to Uncut Mountain Press, and Tuesday you have a big sale. Be able to get this book. I highly recommend it. I highly recommend people look into this issue, and again, not in the spirit of divisiveness, but in the spirit of discerning what the fullness of teaching the Orthodox faith has been. And I think this interview and what you've been providing for this tonight, Father's really done that. So I will call it a day and end the show as I end all of them by quoting Jesus' rock. Fight to death for the truth, and the Lord God will fight for you. God bless you. Have a great day.
Amen.